Welcome to Authors at Google. My name's Katina Johnson, and I work in consumer operations in the online sales and operations department. And we're here today to welcome Stephanie Griest. I like to describe her as someone who has lived life. She's traveled across America in a hatchback named Bertha, and mingled with Russian mafia and worked in China on newspapers and working on Chinese propaganda, belly dance with Cuban Roomba dancers, and she's here today to talk about her book, Mexican Enough, which also includes a great set of stories involving travel and being with a Polish thief and a border patrol agent and a dominatrix. So definitely lots of stories, lots of great stories about living life. But ultimately, I think her book also talks about kind of finding your identity as you grow up and try and travel and figure out who you are. So this has also led to a series of other memoirs across the block, which details her time in Moscow, Beijing, and Havana. And it's 1,000 places that every woman should travel. Two that I've read and I think are definitely worth checking out. So without further ado, I want to introduce Stephanie, and she's here to talk about Mexican Enough.
Thanks so much. So, well, everybody, thank you so very much for being here. I'm really delighted to be here at Google talking with all of you today. So, probably the most important part of my biography that was left out is that I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas. Is anybody here from Corpus Christi, Texas? Or anybody from the Valley? Anybody from, all right, people from the Valley. Okay, so you, my friends, will understand what I say. When my whole entire upbringing, my whole my early years, my teens, was all spent in trying to get out of South Texas. I was desperate to escape South Texas. Wanderlust literally pumped through my veins. My great-great-uncle Jake was a hobo who saw all of America with his legs dangling over the edge of a freight train. My father was a drummer for the U.S. Navy Band, and he drummed his way all around the world. So I just grew up with hearing these most amazing bedtime stories about faraway places. And I've just always known that I wanted to grow up and be the kind of woman whose stories began with, once in Abu Dhabi, I'll never forget that time in Ouagadougou when. I want to be the kind of woman who bought her funky jewelry from its country of origin instead of the booth at the mall. Just how to figure out the details, right? How, where, and with whose money. So anyway, my journey basically began in 1996 when I was still at the University of Texas at Austin when I was an exchange student, and ended up studying Russian, really crazy language. And, I was in trouble the very first day when, teacher walks in, says hello to us. Anyone know how to say hello in Russian? Здравствуйте. In Spanish, it's hola, right? So I was like, oh, man, I'm in for a tough ride. But anyway, stuck it out. Ended up spending a year in Moscow, during which time it was a really, really wild time to be in Moscow, actually. The Soviet Union had collapsed 5 years prior. So the Chechen War was raging. The ruble was falling. The mafia had infiltrated every aspect of Russian society, from the Beggar's Row to the Kremlin and everything in between, including the guy I was dating. But I ended up staying there for quite a bit of time, ended up spending time working at a children's shelter. There's over 1 million orphans in Russia. Most of them are actually not, or rather homeless youth, over 1 million homeless youth in Russia. Majority of them are actually not orphans. They do have a mother and father, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union, times are really tough. They've taken to the bottle for solace, and the children just sort of run rampant. Cover the presidential elections. Anyway, had a that was sort of like the birthing of my sort of activist stage of life, and really, really, really got me thinking and feeling and being about travel. From there, I headed to Beijing, China, where I was an editor at the English mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party. Raise your hand if that sounds like an interesting job description. Yeah, no. So I was sort of picturing myself sneaking out in the middle of the night, going down to the local prison cell, writing a subversive message and sticking it into a dumpling and sliding it through the iron bars, the prison cell of Guangdong and all the other demonstrators from Tiananmen Square in 1989. It's not quite what happened. My official title there was foreign expert. My unofficial title was propaganda polisher. That's basically what I did for a year, polish propaganda. But of course, learned a lot about sort of free speech and democracy from being in that sort of circumstance. And then from there, I headed out to Cuba. And of course, Cuba is a land that's the people who've undergone just sort of extreme state repression, oppression, repression, had a lot of difficult times. But they're also people that really know how to sing and to dance. And it seemed like everybody I met there was an artist, was a musician, was a painter, was a dancer. The problem, however, is I couldn't talk to any of them. And why would that be? Because I spoke Russian, I spoke Chinese. But I never, in fact, took any time to learn the language of my heritage, of my ancestry, which is Mexico. And there's actually a reason for that. I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas. This is a city that is about 150 miles north of the border. And it's really, demographically, of course it's changing now, but when I was growing up, it was pretty much half Mexican-American, half white. And some of the Mexican-American families had been there for several generations, and some people had just recently crossed the border. So anyway, half and half town. And my family reflected that. My mother was Mexican-American, second generation, meaning I'm third generation. And my father was white, gringo, white man from Kansas, basically. I'd like to say I have something in common with Obama, Anyway, so that's sort of like how I sort of grew up. And I never really thought anything unusual about this. In fact, there probably are a number of mixed families in South Texas. But as I came to realize one day in elementary school, in South Texas, you kind of have to choose which one you are. So what happened for me is there was this one day in elementary school when the teacher announced there were too many of us, and we had to be split into two groups. And so very systematically, she began sending all the little brown Mexican kids to one side of the room, and all the little white kids to the other side of the room, one by one, one by one, one by one. And looking back on this, what I realized today that probably what she was doing was dividing us up for an ESL class. Of course, at the time, we didn't really realize that, right? It was really traumatic to suddenly, all of us being split up, sent in different directions, because we'd been together, for a year or so by that point. And she got to me. I was the last person she got to. And she looked down at me, and she said, "What are you, Stephanie? Are you Hispanic or are you white?" And I just looked at her, and I was like, what? Both? Neither? Either? Which one? And so I looked over at the little white kid group, and I kind of saw what was going on over there. And then I looked over at the brown kid group, and I realized my best friend was there, Melida Borsurto. So I said, "I'm Mexican." And she goes, "OK." So I ran over to that group, and we got led into a different room. And that's when I realized that there was a profound difference between me and these other students. These other students all spoke beautiful Spanish. That's a language they spoke in their home. But their English was a bit limited. And so when they passed around the primary, they kind of stumbled upon the words. It was difficult for them to do this reading. And I remember just suddenly getting literally this heart palpitation, like, oh my God, if I stay with this group, I'm going to be left behind. So when class was over, I'm terribly ashamed that I said it. I put it in this sort of a way, but I looked at the teacher and I said, "I want to be what the smart kids are. What can I do?" And she said, "I think you should join the other group too." And so the next day I joined the other group. And then for the rest of my kind of growing up years in Corpus Christi, anytime anyone ever asked what I was, which was a pretty much like weekly experience for me, I always said that I was white. Until one day in my senior year in high school. So again, keeping with this idea, I really want to get out of here. Got to get out of here. Got to get out far and wide. Got to get out of Corpus Christi. And I sort of thought, the quickest way to do this, the easiest way, the most logical way that my parents would be accepting of would be to go to college, right? To go to college out of Corpus Christi. So I began to spend every waking moment in the guidance counselor's office where they kept all the little scholarship bins. And so I was flipping through that, flipping through that, flipping through that one day. And my guidance counselor came up to me. And she looked at me and she goes, "Stephanie, what are you? Are you Hispanic or are you white?" And it was, again, what do I say? What is the right answer? What is the wrong answer? I don't know what to say. And she looked at me and she said, "Your SAT scores, if you're considered Mexican, I don't really know what you're going to get. I mean, if you're considered white, I don't really know what you're going to get. If you're considered Mexican, there might be some opportunities for you." And I said, "Really?" She said, "Yes." And I said, "OK." So we literally got a bottle of whiteout, and we whited out the W on my transcript, and we changed it to a big fat H for Hispanic. And it was kind of extraordinary what doors that one little act opened for me. Suddenly I was applicable to apply for a whole other realm of funding. And I did. I applied for all these different grants and fellowships, scholarships, and money came in. And of course, at the moment, I was totally elated. Woohoo, I'm going to college, with a little money to spare. This is amazing. But then when I actually got there, and I began to meet the other recipients of this award that I'd been given to go to UT Austin, guilt just came on like a hurricane. You know, I began to realize that these other students had really borne, they'd suffered from the way they appeared. You know, many of them, actually a number of the students that I met were migrant farm workers. They were the children of migrant farm workers. Maybe some of them actually spent summers picking beets, picking fruit themselves. Regardless, you know, they had sort of borne the hardship of their skin color. And it just suddenly occurred to me that I had reaped in the benefits of being a minority and none of the drawbacks. And again, just the guilt, the guilt, the guilt. And I called my mom one night, actually the night after we had this big sort of reception to meet everybody. And I called her crying. I was like, I can't be here. I shouldn't be here. I don't deserve to be here. I should, you know, take out a loan, transfer to a cheaper school. Like, I shouldn't be here. I'm not Mexican enough to accept these different scholarships and fellowships. And my mom's like, what? You're crazy, you know? And my mom's like, you know, I suffered a great deal for being Mexican. You know, when she was in class, this kind of like one of the defining moments of my own mother's life was I think she was in 5th grade. And she got overheard, the teacher overheard her speaking Spanish to her brother in the middle of school, in the middle of class. And the teacher took her up, stood her in front of the classroom, and shoved a bar of soap in her mouth to wash out this sort of dirty language. Does any of you have anyone here maybe has a mother that had that experience or a grandparent that's had that experience? Yeah, it's a very, very common experience in South Texas. Usually everyone's like, yeah, that happened to my mother, or that happened to my father. So when something like that happens, do you want to pass on the language? You know, maybe not so much, right? So that's the reason that the language hadn't been passed on to me. And moreover, just kind of basic sort of cultural heritage kinds of things hadn't really been passed on to me either. So my mother's like, you're crazy. This is like a poetic justice that, you know, my daughter has a benefit to something that had only been a hindrance for me in my own growing up years. And so she sort of urged me to keep the scholarship. And admittedly, you know, of course, I wanted to stay where I was. I wanted to stay at the University of Texas. But I decided that in order to like accept all of these scholarships and grants and special treatment that I'd been given because I'm Hispanic, that I had to earn that H on my transcript. So I then set about Mexicanizing myself. And I did this very studiously. You know, I began to wear the Virgen de Guadalupe all over my body and, you know, hang her up in my walls. I began to take Chicano politics classes. I began to do some volunteer work, you know, volunteer with Latino students, migrant students. Began to drink a lot of margaritas. You know, got really good at shooting tequila, things of that sort. But I never went far enough because at the end of the day, I had this mad, crazy wanderlust, and all I wanted to do was go. And I saw Russian as sort of my ticket out to this other world. But by and by, as I began to travel to these places, you know, I lived for a year in Russia, I lived for a year in China. I spent a whole year just traveling around the former Soviet Union, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tibet, Vietnam, Cuba. As I began to do all this traveling, like a good 4-year period of my life that I was just on the road, traveling continuously, I suddenly realized something kind of profound about, and all these nations, you know, what do all these nations have in common? All those nations I just described. Starts with the C. Communism, right? Communism or post-communism, yes. These are all sort of communist, post-communist nations. What they all have in common is that the leaders of these different nations had sort of systematically tried to strip away what made all of these people unique. You know, during the Soviet Union, for example, Stalin forced all of these people, all of the Uzbeks and the Lithuanians and the Latvians and the Kyrgyz that spoke so many different languages, that worshiped so many different religions, that had so many different things that made them, you know, beautiful and original and unique. He stripped all of it away. They were forced to speak Russian and to speak only Russian, and to be punished if they spoke any language other than Russian. And they had to write only in Russian. They were punished if they wrote in any other language other than Russian. They had to give up their churches, give up their temples, give up their ashrams, give up their mosques, and sort of become this part of this like atheist socialist Soviet state. But yet they defied it. Continuously as I was traveling around this part of the world, I remember once I was in Lithuania, in Vilnius, Lithuania, and I met this old gentleman. He's probably 60 years old. And he, actually no, probably more like 65 years old, I would say. And he'd spent a lot of his 20s in prison, being tortured on a ritual basis, because he refused to renounce Judaism. You know, when I was in Tibet, I met all of these monks who worshiped the Dalai Lama, but they had to do so in private. They had the works of the Dalai Lama sort of like hidden beneath their mattresses. They dug these little holes and kept his works and kept his images there, buried deep Even though if they'd been caught with any of these things, they would certainly be defrocked. They would be banished from the monastery. These are things that still happen today, in fact, in Tibet. But they did it because they did not want to betray their ancestry. They did not want to betray where they had come from. And it suddenly dawned on me that all these people made these great sacrifices for their culture, and I had totally walked away and abandoned my own culture. So that's sort of how I end my first book, Around the Block, My Life in Moscow, Beijing, and Havana. This realization that maybe now it's time to turn within, to do some kind of like root searching within. So that was sort of like the first indication that it's time for me to go and do something of that nature. The second inclination happened here. I'm going to do a really brief reading to you from Mexican Enough. Once, when I was 6, I leaped in front of a moving car. My lip split halfway to my ear. As a surgeon stitched my cheek, I decided that motor vehicles were death machines and should be avoided. This is why I live in New York City. Subways. On the rare occasion that I find myself in the driver's seat, I'm haunted by visions of children darting across the road, perhaps images of my former self. I grip the steering wheel at 11 and 1 o'clock, lurching and braking, like now. I'm sputtering down I-10 in a 92 Mazda, en route from Los Angeles to my parents' house in Corpus Christi, Texas. Today is a Tucson-El Paso leg. I veer off the highway onto an isolated farm road curving along the Mexican border and wind up in a desert choked with cactus and brush. This is my ideal driving scenario. Nobody to hit. The air conditioner has perished, so it's hot as blazes. I roll down the window and contemplate my 30th birthday, which is a month away. My 20s were consumed by my first book, a memoir about traveling around the communist bloc. During the decade it took to research, write, and publish it, I grew keenly aware that I was living backward, more in my past than in my present. It's time to move on. But where? To what? When asked this on my book tour, I had a ready reply: learn Spanish. Despite being third-generation Mexican-American on my mother's side and growing up 150 miles from the Texas-Mexico border, my Spanish is best described as Tarzan light, a primitive vocabulary spoken entirely in the present tense. My mother faced so much ridicule for her accent growing up. She never taught my sister or me to speak it properly. I mostly picked up curse words in school and opted to learn Russian in college. Studies show that only 17% of third-generation Mexicans still speak Spanish fluently, but it riddles me with guilt, especially now that I've entered the publishing world. I'm turning down invitations to speak to groups I supposedly represent because I literally cannot communicate with them. A logical life plan would be to venture across this desert and explore the land and the tongue of my ancestors. But the very notion terrifies me. Ask any South Texan. To us, Mexico means kidnappings and shootouts in broad daylight in Nuevo Laredo, or the unsolved murder of young women in Ciudad Juarez. It means narco-traffickers in every cantina, and explosive diarrhea from every comedor. When I was in high school, a college student got snatched off the street while partying down in Matamoros during spring break. Bound and gagged, he was driven to a ranch run by a satanic cult. Next thing you know, he was menudo. One worshiper wore a belt made out of his victims' spinal cords. So go to Mexico? Thanks, but I'd rather return to Moscow and hunt down my old mafiosi boyfriend. I'm cresting a small hill now. Glistening pools of water appear on the road up ahead, then evaporate. It is dizzyingly hot. I glance down at the gas gauge. It's nearly empty. My cell phone is roaming. Not a soul has passed me on this road. If this Mazda breaks down, I am toast. Better turn around and rejoin the main highway. My foot hovers over the brake as I grasp the clutch. Something appears in the distance. Objects in the middle of the road, moving sluggishly, then quickly. Bears? What kind of bear prowls around the Arizona desert? No, they must be wild dogs. Big ones, standing on their hind legs and running? No, they're people. One figure seems to be a child. My lifelong phantom has actualized. I slam the brakes. They must be Mexicans fleeing the border. I blare the horn. Agua, tengo agua, I scream out the window. They must need water. I have 2 bottles. I must give one to them. But what if water isn't all they need? What if they ask me to take them somewhere? Of course I will say yes. How can I deny a ride to people in the middle of the desert? But what if they don't just want a lift? What if they want my car? Or what if they just take it, toss me to the cactus and roar away? That's what I would do if the tables were turned. Throw out the gringa and go. The irony here is immediate. Nearly every accolade I've received in my life, from minority-based scholarships to book contracts, has been at least partly due to the genetic link that I share with these people charging through the snake-infested brush. What separates us is a twist of geographical fate that birthed me on one side of the border, them on the other. They are too Mexican. I am just enough. Mazda has slowed to a crawl, but those border crossers have vanished. Water shimmers where they once stood. I pause a moment, wondering what to do, and slowly began to accelerate. As I look off into the desert hills from which they descended, a surprising thought flashes through my mind. I want to go to Mexico. So that's what began that journey. And so December 31st, 2004, I basically quit my day job in New York City, put all my stuff in storage, where it's been ever since, actually. I haven't seen it since then. And I jetted out to Mexico City, which is a couple $1,000s, and just this dream to finally learn this language that had just evaded me my entire life. Raise your hand if you could kind of relate to that. Maybe your Spanish isn't quite what it could be. Yes, a couple of us, yeah, the Spanish isn't quite what it could be, or maybe the Hebrew isn't quite what it could be, or the Korean isn't quite what it could be, or the French isn't quite what it could be. You know, just growing up, like, Spanish to me had always been this language. It was always like this party I was not invited to. You know, my mother always sounded just so much more fun in Spanish, you know? Whenever she was with her relatives or tias and tios, like, ah, you know, she was always laughing, cracking up. She was never that funny in English. Anyway, so I finally just wanted to set off and finally learn this goddamn language. However, history had additional plans in store for me. Mexico was really on the brink of a social revolution in 2005, 2006, with the Zapatista red alert down in southern Chiapas, with the APA rebellion of the teachers in Oaxaca, the central state of Oaxaca, with the ridiculous presidential election. I mean, we think that Gore versus, Bush was bad. Like, it has nothing on Obrador versus Calderon. I mean, really, some serious, serious issues were happening in Mexico, and the people were really, really rising. And it was just such an honor to be there with my pad and pen going, mande, ¿qué? You know, alguien, por favor, explícame, ¿qué está pasando? What is going on here? So anyway, so I'm going to kind of like dip into some of the little, I call them sort of underworlds that I wrote about in Mexican Enough, and just kind of like give you like a little taste of a few of them, and then I would really be delighted to have a Q&A about whatever one maybe you're interested in exploring a bit more. You're quickly going to realize that I did not write Eat, Pray, Love Mexico. Okay, this is kind of like Mexico on the raw side. Okay, so first of all, like basically how this whole journey began is that I had this friend, an artist, Chicano artist named Greg Rubio. Love him. And he had happened to spend most of his 20s living in Mexico. He's a Fulbright scholar, and then he just kind of, hung out there, basically. And so he was the first person I contacted when I decided I wanted to go to Mexico. Actually, he was the only person I had to contact about going to Mexico, because most of my friends and family, we're all like terrified of the place, even though we're from there. So anyway, so I called Greg. I was like, yo, Greg, what's up with Mexico? I really want to go. And he's like, well, hey, as it so happens, I'm about to leave. He'd been living there for years, and he'd actually been living, and he kind of told me before, like he lived in this really cool artist commune in Querétaro. Querétaro is sort of right in the center of Mexico, just a couple of hour bus ride away from DF, from Mexico City. Really, really beautiful colonial town. It's both the name of a state and its own capital, Querétaro. So anyway, so he was living there, and he was about to actually leave. He just got a fellowship to go do an art project in Spain. So he said, why don't you just come here and take over my room? You can just step on in, take over, and not that they had a lease, but you can pay my rent, and you'll be there. And as a further enticement, he told me that all of his roommates just so happened at that moment that were all men, all good-looking men, all artists, all visual artists, and none of them spoke a single word of English. And I'm like, sign me up, this sounds great. So what he failed to mention, and what I recognized as soon as I walked the door, is that every single one of them was gay. So, and moreover, the place that we were living in was called La Joteria of Querétaro. Does anyone want a translation of what that means? La joteria? Yeah, okay, so basically, okay, so where do you buy pan, bread? You buy it at the panaderia, right? Okay, where do you find zapatos, shoes? And the zapateria. Well, where do you find jotos, fags? You find them in the joteria, and that's where I lived. So, and so I quickly sort of realized, like, wow, this is actually a really good opportunity to just sort of explore what it means to be Mexican and to be gay. Because, you know, at some point you can kind of say, like, is it possible to be Mexican and be gay? Because, you know, it's such a Catholic nation, and it's especially Querétaro. Querétaro is an extremely, extremely conservative state. Like, literally every 2 feet there's like a gigantic Catholic church, and they're like, wow, watching over the town, watching over what's happening. So it was actually really fascinating, you know, when people would come in, like we are the epicenter of the gay community in this town, and when people would like walk through the door, walk through the threshold, like literally there'd be a transformation. Like they would kind of like walk in, the door would come up, they're like, hey, you know, and they would immediately get the collar on their, you know, on their polo and flick it up, and then they would go head down to the bathroom. We had this, you know, little communal bathroom, and there's this big fat communal jar of hair gel, and they would stick into that and like, you know, stick back their hair, spike up their hair, and then they would go to the stereo and turn on the music. You know, so I go to Mexico thinking, all right, I'm finally going to learn salsa. I'm going to learn some boleros, some corridos. It was Madonna 24/7 in that house. But that was a really beautiful thing. So anyway, I loved living there. You know, not only were they really fabulously entertaining, they taught me a far more colorful vocabulary than I was learning at the language school down the street. And then I kind of also began to realize that the status of gays and lesbians is actually a very revealing barometer to the social progressiveness of a nation. You can kind of tell what's happening in a nation sort of politically, socially, by how gay people are treated, what kind of rights gay people have. And so with that realization, I just began, you know, to do a lot of interviews with people. And to a certain extent, actually, Mexico City, not Mexico, but Mexico City, the capital, is more liberated than a lot of places in the United States. Just in 2006, they passed a same-sex civil union law that gives gay couples the right to inherit pensions and property, to join health and life insurance policies, to make medical decisions for each other. The border state of Coahuila actually passed similar legislation just a couple of months later. So that's really amazing. Mexico was actually the first nation in Latin America to send an openly gay person to their Congress, a lesbian no less. So, so to a degree, you know, Mexico is quite liberated in terms of gay, or at least Mexico City, at least the capital, has some sort of liberated policies. However, at the end of the day, Mexico is a very Catholic nation, and it has a certain image of men, which in a word is what? Men should be macho, right? Okay, so gay men, my friends at the Soteria, they were often at odds with like how to be macho and how to be Mexican. So just as like I had my own sort of like identity with what it means to be Mexican, they also, I kind of began to realize different crowds, different people that I was meeting also had their own sort of question what it means. And hate crimes are really astounding. Very, very briefly, there was this extraordinary activist living in Querétaro at that time. His name was Octavio Rubio Acuña, 28 years old, had 2 master's degrees, one in social work and one in counseling. And he did something that he wanted to do something for the community, for the gay community. So he decided to open up a condoneria, which is what? A condom store, okay? And you actually will often see condom stores. They're very, very common throughout Mexico. You'll find them pretty much in any major city. But his was like was the only gay, openly gay condom store. So you walked in, there was a gigantic rainbow flag. You know, it had a little bookstore with books like Mamá, Papá, Soy Gay. You know, it was like really this sort of like open thing. And because he was a clinical psychologist, on the upstairs level, the upper level of the condom store, he had counseling sessions. And he was booked, you know, like every day of the week there were people that were coming in to have counseling sessions and the process of coming out and how to tell their family and how to share it with their loved ones and things of that sort. So anyway, it did not take long before what he was doing attracted the attention of the police. And there was this one policeman in particular who began to, you know, kind of came into the store one day. They had a big argument. You know, the policeman was like, you need to shut this down. This is not a family business. And he said, what do you mean? You know, I'm only doing what all the other stores do. They had this altercation, and his life began to change rather dramatically after that. The store got broken into. The store got spray painted with homophobic graffiti. His tires in the car, tires on his car got slashed. He began to get death threats on his cell phone. This is actually something that often happens to activists in Mexico. It's really terrifying. You get a death threat on your cell phone, you change the cell phone number, within a week, you get another call. Change it again, within a week, you get another call. They somehow manage to find you. And he began to get quite afraid. He filed a queja, a complaint, in the state's Department of Human Rights in Querétaro. Then he filed another one at the national level. No help ever came. And then at 5 o'clock on a Thursday, some young people came in for their counseling session. They found him in the back of a condeneria, stabbed 6 times, dead. His wallet was bulging out of his pocket, his back pocket, full of credit cards, full of money. Nothing was touched in the store. It was clearly a hit. It was a hate crime. And it came to find hundreds of these go every year. So that was sort of what sort of transformed my trip, you know, when I first arrived. It's just like, we're going to learn Spanish, we're going to have a good time, we're going to dance Madonna, it's going to be great, you know. And then it was like, wow, there are serious issues happening in this nation. And again, like sort of my activist pull was like, it's time to record, it's time to listen, it's time to write. So anyway, that was sort of the first of the issues that I kind of really looked into while I was there. The second one was this. This is a little more fun. Who is this? El Santo, yes! El Santo, and he is who? The most famous luchador ever to walk the planet. Anybody want to guess how many matches this man won? Just guess. Just throw out a number. 40 years, 40-year career. How many matches did he win? 300. Anyone else? 3,000. Anyone else? 5,000. Or as he liked to say, all of them. And don't fret if you never were able to see, you know, Santo in action in the ring. He actually died in 1983, buried in his silver lame mask. But if you didn't get a chance to see him in the ring then, he left behind a legacy of no less than 50 action films. My personal favorite of which is El Santo versus the Mummies of Guanajuato. Really, really great television viewing. Anyway, so the man is like an icon in Mexico. Everywhere you go, you see El Santo, El Santo, El Santo. You see him everywhere. And so I really wanted to, like, you know, kind of get in with the legacy of El Santo. And so I tried to get an interview with El Hijo de Santo, the son of Santo. He has a mask that's just reversed. It's white with silver trim. But, you know, just try to get through that man's PR agent. It's not going to happen. So anyway, it didn't happen. So I had to settle for the next best thing, which is someone who actually fought him in the ring. This man was one of my favorite people to interview in Mexico. His name was Bulldog Quintero. He is the oldest continuously fighting wrestler in Mexico. This is his daily schedule. He does the graveyard shift at the local gas station, goes in at midnight, works till about 6, 7 a.m., goes home, takes a little brief nap, goes to the gym at noon, trains, then goes into the ring and fights all night, 3 to 4 times a week. How old do you suppose he is? How old can someone possibly be to do that kind of schedule?
60.
65. 65. The man does not have a single tooth left. And he can actually tell you, the biography of every single tooth. He's like, oh, this one, mija. This one was La Pantera. This one, mija. This was El Raton. You know? So he can tell you what happened to all of his different teeth. Anyway, so we were there interviewing, and he's telling me all these crazy stories about him fighting El Santo and him fighting this person and that person, like losing a majority of his fights, in fact, but still in the ring, still out there fighting. And once this one moment happened when Mrs. Bulldog came home, kind of slammed the door kind of made this loud noise, and he turned. And something plopped out of his neck. It was a tumor the size of half a baseball. Plop. And that's when I realized something very profound, and that is that Mexicans that I encountered on this long journey are tough in a way that I cannot fathom. Resilient in a way that I will never fathom. All from Bulldog Quintero. So then after that was sort of my journey in Querétaro, like kind of hanging out with luchadors, hanging out with my gay friends. And then I kind of began to get the pull south, you know, after seeing what life was sort of like in northern and central Mexico. I wanted to see what life was like in more southern Mexico, where you have the indigenous people, and moreover, the indigenous resistance movement. So now I'm going to do a little fashion show change for you. So you can see right now I'm wearing what? A mantón de manilla. I got this in Barcelona, right? Okay, so I'm wearing this to represent the colonizers, right? The Spanish, okay? Who came about 500 years ago. Wearing something, maybe the women, something similar to this. They arrived, however, and discovered people wearing something like this. Okay, anyone know what this is called? A huipil, right? And can you recognize where this huipil is from? Right, exactly. And do you know which women in Oaxaca wear this? Take it. Okay. Choice A is Zapotec. Choice B, Triqui. Choice C, the Huateco. the Triqui. Is this going to be fuzzy? The Triqui. Oops. Hey, can you get that? Thanks. So yeah. So as you began to travel sort of south into the southern regions of Mexico, you encounter, and actually not just Mexico, but all of sort of Central America, you encounter women wearing these beautiful, beautiful blouses, which are called huipiles, right? And so I'm wearing one that's worn by the women of Oaxaca, part of the Triqui Nation, which is sort of from northern Oaxaca. What's amazing about these beautiful blouses is this. They kind of form a textile roadmap to this part of the Americas. You can tell where you are by the huipiles, by the colors and the designs of what the women are wearing. And furthermore, you can see the women creating these. You know, they kneel into the earth. They have this backstrap loom that is connected to their womb. And it goes up to the highest point of their home, the highest point of their hut, tied up to the hut. And by doing this, they believe they have a direct connection to their ancestors who whisper what to weave. And so they're sitting there weaving their stories. If you're very good at reading huipiles, in addition to being able, like I can kind of tell, you know, okay, then this woman is a Triqui, this is a Huateco, this is a Zapoteca, this is a this is a that. You know, your eyes kind of get trained to like what the different groups wear. But if you're really good at reading them, you can also tell something about the actual woman. You can tell if she's married. You can tell something about her family name. You can tell different things about her biography by what it is she is wearing. So anyway, as I began to travel south, I'm actually not going to, there are a number of different groups that I spent time with. And I would love to talk, if you're particularly interested in one of them, we can definitely talk about it in the Q&A. The first group were the Zapatistas. You know, I spent time in Chiapas hanging out with Marcos and hanging out with the Zapatistas in Oventic, which is sort of the Caracol, the governing center that is nearest to San Cristóbal de las Casas. So if you're interested in that, we can talk about that in a bit. A really, really cool community center. And I also spent time in Oaxaca working with the EPR, the Ejército Popular Revolucionario. One thing that I was really amazed to learn in Mexico is that, you know, you all hear about the Zapatistas, right? We always hear about the Zapatistas and their resistance movement, their indigenous resistance movement, because they're sort of like what put the indigenous resistance movement on the map. But in fact, there's at least 30 or 40 other indigenous resistance groups that have none of the fame, none of the groupies. Like the Zapatistas literally have groupies that come from all over the world to come down and sort of help them in their resistance movement. So I spent time with that particular group. Spent time with the strikers in Oaxaca. And let me just tell like a brief story about that. And that is this. I like to say that Mexicans have as many words for strike as Eskimos do for snow. Okay, it is no joke. It is something they take incredibly, incredibly seriously. And they do it with a resilience that always blew me away. The highest form of a strike is called the plantón. And the plantón is basically where what happens, it's like the last, you know, it's the last stand, you know, you've been fighting for something and they're just not giving in, the government is not giving in. So you say, fine, then we're not going to give in either. And so you basically go to the center of power, which in a Mexican city is what? The plaza, or the zocolo, that is sort of like, you know, surrounded by the different government buildings. You go there with all of your crew, with a piece of cardboard, or a bedroll, or maybe a tarp. You roll it out, and you sit on it, and you do not move until your demands are met, or until you are physically removed. Guess how long the longest plantón that I personally researched and wrote about, but I'm not saying this is the longest plantón in history, but the one that I personally uncovered, just to take a guess, how long do you suppose that would be? That a group of people can sit there under the hot sun, on top of tarp, and just sit and wait until the demands are met. How long would you say? 6 months? Anything else?
3 years.
3 years, okay. Very close. 4 years. Can you imagine? For 4 years, a group that was accused of being the EPR, the Ejército Popular Revolucionario, but in fact they were not. 4 years, they sat in the Zocalo in downtown Oaxaca, making their tamales, making their tortillas, making babies. 8 babies were born on the plaza during this 4-year period of time. No joke. Craziness. Okay, so that is a little story about Mexican resilience. And then, of course, no talk about resilience in the nation to our south can be complete without a brief word about undocumented workers. So I would like to end the little talk with that. I'm sure immigration is something that you all have thought about a great deal, read about a great deal, can probably have an amazing debate about. We know, as we all know, we have a 2,000-mile border that we share with Mexico. Depending on the statistics you read, anywhere from 300,000 to 400,000 to up to 500,000 people cross that border every single year. Depending on the statistics you read, between 1 in 8 or 1 in 10 in Mexicans lives here without papers. So it's an incredible number of people. It's an incredible, amazing journey, and often very tragic journey. There's actually a group in Houston, the University of Houston, called the Border Death Project, and their whole goal is to determine how many people die crossing each year. Come up to about 500 or so. It's really an extraordinary thing, tragic thing. So I ended up interviewing hundreds of people about their experience, not only crossing, but being the family that gets left behind. One tragic thing that you see in Mexico, as you travel around the countryside, you're continuously coming upon villages that it's like there was this sort of genocide of the male gender. It is entirely bereft of males. When you go to these villages, and boys, boys of maybe 15 and higher, they're just gone. They're just not there. And then maybe you have men that are sort of in their 60s and 70s, and that's it. But all men between the ages of 15 and 50, gone. They're all here. Women are beginning to migrate in greater numbers than before. And so now you have some villages in Mexico where there's just no middle-aged people. There's little bitty kids, and there's viejitos, and there's nobody in between. It's just like the social impact this is going to have in Mexico is just, it's calamitous. It's already becoming calamitous. So I ended up doing all of these interviews, and one of the many things that sort of struck me, one of the first things that kind of initially strike me about it, is a term that they use to describe themselves. What these undocumented workers, how they refer to themselves. And that word is what? Do we know that word? Mojado, right? The mojado word. Okay, sorry? I guess I'm hearing echoes. Okay, so yes, mojado. So I don't know about you, but growing up in South Texas, where I'm from, if you call somebody mojado, boom, you get a slap in the face. It means wetback, right? It's an incredibly derogatory thing to call someone of Latino descent. But what I was surprised and amazed to discover is that this is actually the word that so many undocumented workers use to describe themselves. Soy mojado, soy mojado. Everybody says it, everybody does it. Everybody uses that word. And I began to think, during this passage, when they do make this crossing, they often literally do cross a body of water. They often do cross the Rio Grande, or some other river. Regardless, they're going to sweat a lot. So they literally are drenched by the time they arrive to the United States, Del Norte, soaked with, with the water of the river, or soaked with just their own sweat, with their own anxiety. So it literally is a crossing of water. And I began to see it in almost like a biblical term. It's a baptism. It's this pilgrimage from one world into the next, a transformation. Soy mojado. If you're a mojado, you survived. Only the survivors get to be called the mojado. So I'm actually writing a play called the Mojado Monologues. And so that's just kind of bringing all of these voices, which we so often do not hear. So I'm just going to close this little talk with you. I'm going to read to you one Mojado monologue, and then we'll open up for questions. And this Mojado monologue is by a man named Angel Castillo. He was born and raised in Milagro, which is a pueblo in Querétaro, the state that I spent a lot of time in. His eyes are red. He smells faintly of liquor when we meet. But if anybody has an excuse to be partying at 9 in the morning, it's him. He's about to cross the desert for the dozenth time at the end of the week. He's wearing a bright yellow baseball cap. His name, Angel, is painted across the front. Tattoos of foliage and hearts adorn his arms. He's 32 years old. This is his story. Well, we always cross through Laredo. It's much better to cross the border there than any place else. Tijuana, that's the worst. I don't like Reynosa either. I once got mugged there. He took my earring and my ring and my necklace and even my shirt because it had the Virgin de Guadalupe on it. I don't like Reynosa para nada. It takes about 4 days to cross the border. I pack 2 of everything. Pants, shirts, socks. I also pack food, corn, tortillas, frijoles, cookies, whatever is light, and 2 liters of water. There's water in the mountains, but it's pretty dirty. It's beautiful, though, and peaceful. We always walk during the night. It's cold in the winter. In the mornings, our water has ice in it. I once saw a man beneath the tree. I thought he was sleeping, but he was dead. I think he was a drunk. A lot of people get drunk before they cross the border. It's a really bad idea. Sometimes we find people who've been abandoned by their coyote, their smuggler. We invite them to walk with us. Sometimes they're in big groups, like 50 or 100. There's a lot of migra, the border patrol, a lot of migra on the highway, and they've got helicopters. But if you cross at night, you can avoid them. A couple of times I've run into the migra, but they just ask if we're Mexican and if we've got our papers. We say no. They put us in their Jeep, which has air conditioning, and they give us cookies and water, and they drive us back to the border. I don't mind because they're just doing their job. And they tell us maybe we'll have better luck next time. Because they know we're just doing our jobs too. I like your migra much better than ours. I do all sorts of work in El Norte, but usually trash or construction in Louisiana or Alabama. And Mexicans, we work 13 hours a day. We work 14 hours a day. We come in even if we're sick. The bosses, they like us a lot because they say we work like burros. And we do. Like Mexican burros, though. Not like American burros. Your burros, they live like kings. They don't do anything. They just pinche burros. But they live better than me. Americans don't make them work. They won't kill them for anything. We work 6 days a week. On Sundays, we rest. Sometimes we go fishing, but we don't have a license, so it's risky. I drive, but I don't have a license, so that's risky too. My whole life in El Norte is illegal. Sundays are fun because we're all together, we make food, we eat, we drink, we fish. But it's also the hardest day because we think about our families here. But we built a house with our money. My girls have a bed now. My wife has clothes now. I don't ever want my daughters to go to El Norte, not ever. That's why I go, so they don't have to. So anyway, that is a little bit about my journey. Yes. Thanks so much. So there's actually 3 books I'm seeing up here. Anybody want a book? All right, one back over here. Actually, 2 back over here, then one over here. So, questions. Anybody have questions? Yes.
Thank you for coming to Google. I have a question. So Mexico, some people think of it as a country of 3 different regions: the south, the center, and then the north. Have you had a chance to go to the other regions besides the south?
Yes, yes. I actually did spend time in the north and the central and the south, yes. And what I discovered that was so interesting, again, like, you know, the large reason for me going here is to kind of like have my own sort of Mexican identity search. And what I was really fascinated to discover is that Mexicans have the very same identity crisis. As a matter of fact, what it means to be Mexican in a way, if you think about it, it's a biracial nation by definition. So cultural schizophrenia is literally encoded in our DNA. You know, so if you're Mexican and you're confused about what that means, or just kind of any degree of Latino, like that's what it means to be Latino in a way. So in the North, people struggle with being malinchista. Like that means you're too much like the North, you're too much like Estados Unidos, you're too much like the US, you know. So you're not Mexican enough, you know, when you like as in nationally. That's sort of the argument they have in the North. You know, in the South, a lot of my friends that I encountered that are kind of maybe more activists, intellectual artists, philosophers, musicians, those people try to, they really want to be seen as more indigena, you know, because like to be indigena is to be like more down with the people. And so they're always like, you know, you're not indigenous enough, you're not this enough, you're not that enough. So it's very interesting. I kind of noticed that in these sort of like regional differences, the different sort of identity, cultural identity struggles that they have as well. Yeah. Yeah, so it was great. Yes,
well,
did you have a?
My last question would be, part of life is dying. So when you die and you go to the pearly gates, in what language would you like to be welcomed?
Oh, wow. Well, they actually say, what is that saying? Like, French is a language of love, and German is a language of business, and Spanish is the language of God, you know. So I imagine that I will be greeted in Spanish if I make it up there. Anyway, that's lovely. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
So I was kind of just curious. You said here you're trying to figure out growing up who you are, and a lot of that is when you grow up as part of different cultures in the U.S. that's forced on you by people who forget that a lot of us are all from different cultures.
Yes.
But what was your experience when you were actually in Mexico? Did you feel that same pressure like you were saying previously?
Okay, so the question is basically, you know, when I was in Mexico, did I have the same experience as I did in the United States of people wondering, am I this or am I that? Well, what was really interesting about, and I'm sure any of you who are Mexican-American who spend any time in Mexico, I mean, just try to like introduce yourself as Chicano or Mexican-American, and they're like, ha, you know, what? You have nothing in common with me. You're a gringo. You know what I mean? Like, no matter how down with it you think that you are, like, it's a really sort of, they're very quick to break down that notion that you might have, that you're anything remotely like that. And it was really an interesting experience for me. You know, like just for years now, I've spoken about Mexicans sort of in the third person, like we, or no, first person, right? First person plural, like the we. But then I quickly had to learn how to like shift to the you all, you know, and the they, because anytime I would ever sort of like express a we in Mexico, they were quick to say, you're not us, you know, and I totally, of course, respect that. So yes, to be this sort of border, so it's, yes, so the quickest way to kind of like realize you're a U.S. citizen is to go spend any time in another country. So to them, that's like all it is. And I think people kind of like had an appreciation. Well, people definitely had an appreciation. People in Mexico are incredibly proud of their nation. They think it's the greatest nation in the world. So they're like, of course you want to come and learn more about, you know, if you think you have something in common with me, of course you want to learn more about me because we're the best, you know. So that's something that I really loved as well. But yes, I don't recommend referring to yourself as a Chicano when you're in Mexico because they will only laugh. Which is sort of a term that I'd always embraced. Has anyone had a similar experience? Oh, yes.
With all this travel, what's the next travel destination?
What's my next travel destination? Well, you know, I've actually been spending some time in Africa this year. I was in Johannesburg, Mozambique, and Swaziland in January and February, and my boyfriend and I are actually planning a trip to Cameroon in December. So I'm thinking that's probably, Africa's been a really interesting, completely, unbelievably different from anything I've experienced in Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe. That's a whole other realm. So yes, so I think that's maybe, yes.
Do you plan to do the U.S.? Because I feel that a lot of the things that you said about Mexico are equally applicable.
Yes, okay, so the question was, would I plan to do this in the U.S.? And as a matter of fact, I once spent a year of my life driving about 45,000 miles around the United States. So I actually feel like I know the United States better than I know any other place. And in the past couple of years, I've actually been nomadic for 2 years now. The year that I lived in a car, that was in 2000, 2001. So I really just got this, that is actually when I became a patriot, actually, of the United States. You know, my own experience traveling abroad has always been like, you know, I just get upset with different policies and things that are happening here. But it actually took a year of relying on the kindness of U.S. citizens, people in this nation, that I really came to have a deep, compassionate love for the people of this nation. It's a really beautiful place. And actually the past 2 years of my life, I've been completely nomadic. My stuff's still in storage in New York. I don't know when I'll get it out. And I'm just kind of living in a combination of writers' colonies, writers' residencies, doing book tours, crashing with friends, you know, on their couches like Katina, and so doing things like that. So yes. Anyway, so yes, the United States is really. I mean, sometimes like we think of traveling, we're like, oh, we got to go far, and that was certainly my thought. You know, when I was in Corpus Christi, just like wanting to travel. Like, the furthest place I could think of was Russia. So I was like, that's where I want to go. You know, but in fact, some of the most amazing traveling we can possibly do is just get in a car and boom, or better yet, Greyhound. I mean, you will see a whole other side of humanity by traveling Greyhound, which I frequently actually do on my book tour. It's a whole other world, a whole other U.S. world, and Greyhound, and just, you know, go out and see what our own this nation has to offer. It's quite extraordinary.
I have also another question.
Yes.
Well, I actually I kind of identify with a lot of things. I grew up actually in the border.
Yeah.
I'm not Chicano, I'm actually Mexican.
Yes.
Had a chance to come here to work for Google. But on the personal side, I identified with you when you said like you went to Russia and other places, because this summer I spent it in South America with the indigenous people there. So growing in the border area of Mexico, you said, we are kind of half in between. So I personally never got the chance to kind of live that part closely. So I actually had a chance to join an activist movement there. And in my case, it was kind of learning about Mexican culture from outside or from a different angle. And I think like maybe you mentioned a little bit when you're thinking about communism and you were in other parts, you were kind of extrapolating to your own heritage. So I don't know if you can comment on that kind of second part. And if I extrapolate your experience, I haven't done that journey in Mexico myself yet. I did it, for example, in India, and it was amazing. But the crucial part, I knew, for example, in India, I was not going to go back and live. What was your experience when you were in all these places? You saw people there, like they're going through all these tribulations and trouble. And I assuming that you were thinking, well, I'm not going to stay here forever anyway, so I might as well just indulge myself in everything, because that's a real dilemma that I have. Like sometimes I try to immerse myself, and I know the key difference is whether when you know you're going to stay there or you are just transient.
Yes, that is actually something that I've often had a lot of difficulty as well. You know, you go and you see and you experience like the hardship, but then you always know that in the back of your mind you can go to a place where you'll completely escape it all. And so I guess the way that I've just sort of been able to work with my own conscience, although obviously like I'm Catholic, I suffer extreme guilt, so it really like lays me on thick when I'm traveling to, and all my travel has been mostly in the developing world. So it's, you know, but I guess that's why I'm really grateful to just be a writer, because I feel like in some way I really do believe in stories. I really, really, really believe in the power of stories, and I really believe that stories, it can be very empowering for the person telling the story. You know, I've interviewed a lot of people who've never been interviewed before, which is one of the reasons why I left newspaper business, because you're often interviewing, you know, people that are like politicians or celebrities or whatever. Like, I hated that. I really love to interview people that have never spoken to anyone before, and they do. It is sort of like this kind of cathartic thing to get out that story and to sort of share it. Something that really blew me away about Mexican people in particular is that, you know, my experience interviewing people in Russia and, you know, all over the former Soviet Union and interviewing Chinese was that they were always really, really scared to give me their name, and with very good reason. You know, in the case of Russians, maybe I think it was just like this paranoia left over from the sort of Soviet regime. Chinese often could be ramifications of talking to an outsider, but Mexicans also really had something at stake, but they never wanted to change their name. They're like, no, I want my story out, and you put my name, you put my full name, you know, because I am tired of being anonymous. I'm tired of suffering in silence. I want my story to be shared. So that was amazing. And actually, there's actually one part of the book that I go into that I have not resolved. And it was actually brought to my attention by one of my roommates in Querétaro, was that as a journalist, aren't you just taking people's stories and using them for your own benefit? And so that's like this whole other level. That's what I'm really trying to deal with now. It's like, at the end of the day, you know, it's like, should I ship half the proceeds of the book, you know, the people that I encounter, you know what I mean? It's like, that sort of a thing is interesting. And that was like kind of one of the big dilemmas in the book, actually. And then I guess the other part is just, I think that kind of what you're alluding to is motherlands and the sort of importance of the first part of your question. And that's just something, I mean, I hope that if y'all take anything away from this little talk here today, it's just, you know, please, at some point in your life, make a journey to that motherland to learn from the roots that grow within you. You know, it was just, for me, it was a really, really, really profound experience. I mean, I'm not fluent in Spanish. I probably will never be fluent in Spanish. But at least now I can have a conversation. At least now, you know, I can conduct an interview. At least now, like, I can catch, you know, half the jokes that are said, you know, like the George Lopez show or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, and it's in a word, that is liberation. It is incredibly just liberating to finally speak this language that had just kept me from speaking with members of my family, with members of my community, you know, with half of my community, in this case, it's South Texas. So yes, so just make that trip from within. It's a beautiful thing. So, are we out of time?
Yeah,
yes.
we are.
Okay. Thank you. Yay.